On the morning of March 8th, 1968, at approximately 7:39 a.m. local time, 98 Soviet sailors aboard the ballistic missile submarine K-129 died instantly when their vessel imploded under the crushing pressure of the northern Pacific Ocean. The submarine, a Gulf II class boat carrying 3 R-21 nuclear-armed ballistic missiles, plunged more than 3 miles to the ocean floor, approximately 6,500 feet, creating an acoustic signature that was detected by American underwater listening posts thousands of miles away. Soviet Pacific Fleet headquarters in Vladivostok waited for a routine communication that would never come. K-129 had departed from the Rybachi Naval Base on the Kamchatka Peninsula on February 24th for a routine combat patrol. The submarine's commander, Captain First Rank Vladimir Kobzar, was an experienced officer who had served in the Soviet Navy for more than 20 years. Each of the 3 R-21 missiles aboard carried a nuclear warhead with a range of approximately 1,400 kilometers. The submarine also carried 2 conventional torpedoes and standard communications equipment for maintaining contact with Pacific Fleet Command. When K-129 missed its scheduled transmission that morning, Soviet naval commanders initially assumed a temporary radio malfunction. Submarines operating at depth frequently experienced communications difficulties, particularly in the northern Pacific where atmospheric conditions could interfere with signals. But when the next scheduled transmission 6 hours later also failed to arrive, concern escalated into alarm. By the evening of March 8th, Pacific Fleet Headquarters had initiated emergency procedures. Over the following 2 months, Soviet naval forces deployed what Western intelligence agencies observed as the most extensive peacetime naval operation in Soviet history. Reconnaissance aircraft flew grid patterns covering more than 20,000 square miles of ocean. Surface ships deployed sonar arrays. Other submarines were diverted to assist in the search. The Pacific Ocean, at the depths where a disabled submarine might sink, presented enormous challenges. Sonar technology in 1968 could detect large metallic objects on the ocean floor, but only at relatively shallow depths and over limited ranges. The average depth in K-129's patrol area exceeded 15,000 feet. At such depths, water pressure reached more than 6,600 pounds per square inch, and darkness was absolute. By mid-May 1968, Soviet officials quietly concluded that K-129 and its entire crew had been lost. Memorial services were held for the 98 crew members, though their families were told only that the men had died in service to the Soviet Union. The specific circumstances of the loss remained classified. The location of the wreck remained unknown to Soviet forces. What Moscow did not know was that the United States Navy had already found K-129. Before we continue with how the CIA pulled off one of the most audacious engineering feats in espionage history, if you're fascinated by the hidden operations of the Cold War and the real human cost behind intelligence missions, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these documented cases every week, bringing you the truth behind history's most consequential secrets. The discovery had occurred through an extensive underwater surveillance network that the U.S. Navy had been constructing throughout the 1960s. The system, designated Sound Surveillance System and known by its acronym SOSUS, consisted of arrays of underwater hydrophones, sensitive microphones designed to detect sound traveling through water, positioned at strategic locations on the ocean floor. The hydrophones were connected by undersea cables to shore stations where Navy personnel monitored for the acoustic signatures of Soviet submarines. SOSUS exploited a phenomenon called the deep sound channel, a layer of water at specific depths where temperature and pressure conditions cause sound waves to travel horizontally for thousands of miles with minimal loss of intensity. By positioning hydrophones within this channel, the Navy could detect submarines operating anywhere in vast areas of ocean. On the evening of March 8, 1968, the same day K-129 failed to make its scheduled transmission, hydrophone arrays positioned northwest of Hawaii detected an anomalous acoustic event. The sound signature was analyzed at the naval facility in Oahu, where specialists compared it against known acoustic patterns. The analysis confirmed an underwater implosion, a submarine hull catastrophically failing under pressure. Based on the time the sound reached different hydrophone arrays, Navy acoustics experts triangulated the location to an area of the northern Pacific roughly 1,560 nautical miles northwest of Hawaii. The coordinates placed the event in international waters, where U.S. surveillance operations were legally permitted. The calculated depth exceeded 3 miles below the surface. At that depth, water pressure was approximately 7,200 pounds per square inch. Temperature hovered just above freezing, and no natural light penetrated. The detection was reported through naval intelligence channels to the Office of Naval Intelligence and to the Central Intelligence Agency. Both agencies recognized the potential intelligence value of a sunken Soviet submarine. K-129 was designed to carry nuclear-armed ballistic missiles. If the submarine could be located and examined, it might yield Soviet missile technology, cryptographic equipment, code books, and other classified materials that could provide significant intelligence advantages. However, examining a submarine resting on the ocean floor at extreme depth presented technical challenges that, in 1968, exceeded any existing capability. The U.S. Navy operated several deep-sea research submersibles, but none were rated for depths greater than 12,000 feet. Even if a submersible could reach the wreck, it could not recover anything larger than small objects. The submarine itself, approximately 320 feet long and weighing more than 2,300 tons, could not be lifted using any known technology. The project to attempt recovery began with a feasibility study conducted during the summer of 1968 by engineers and intelligence analysts working under contract to the CIA. The study, classified top secret and given the code name Project AZORIAN, examined whether existing or near-term technology could accomplish what no one had previously attempted, raising an intact submarine from a depth of more than 3 miles. The study identified several fundamental challenges. Locating the exact position of the wreck would require a detailed survey of potentially hundreds of square miles of ocean floor. Any recovery operation would need to lift more than 2,000 tons of metal from extreme depth without the wreck breaking apart from structural stress. The operation would need to be conducted in international waters, where Soviet reconnaissance could potentially observe American vessels, meaning any recovery ship would need a plausible civilian cover story. The recovered submarine would need to be brought to the surface and transferred to a secure location without Soviet intelligence learning what had been accomplished. Each of these challenges was, by 1968 standards, at or beyond the limits of existing technology. But the potential intelligence value, access to Soviet nuclear missile technology, cryptographic systems, and possibly even intact nuclear warheads, was considered significant enough to justify attempting what engineers privately acknowledged was barely feasible. The man who would oversee the engineering aspects of Project AZORIAN was John Parangosky, a CIA officer who had spent more than 20 years managing classified technical intelligence programs. Parangosky, 47 years old in 1968, had a reputation within the agency for taking on projects that seemed impossible and making them work through aggressive engineering, substantial budgets, and absolute secrecy. He had previously managed the development of reconnaissance satellites and high-altitude spy planes. He understood that AZORIAN would require not just engineering innovation, but also an elaborate deception operation to hide the recovery attempt from Soviet observation. The first phase involved confirming the exact location of the wreck and photographing it to assess its condition. For this, the Navy deployed USS Halibut, a submarine modified to carry specialized deep-sea search equipment. Halibut arrived in the target area in July 1968 and began a systematic search using a deep-towed sonar array and cameras. The search continued for more than 5 weeks, covering a grid pattern across the area where acoustic analysis had indicated the submarine had sunk. In late August 1968, cameras towed by Halibut photographed wreckage on the ocean floor at a depth of 6,500 feet. The images, though grainy and obscured by sediment the camera sled's movement had disturbed, showed what appeared to be a submarine hull resting at a slight angle on the seabed. Subsequent passes captured clearer images showing the conning tower, missile hatches, and other distinctive features that confirmed the wreck was K-129. The photographs revealed that the submarine had not remained intact during its descent. The bow section forward of the conning tower had separated from the main hull, likely torn away when the submarine imploded during its descent or when it struck the ocean floor. The separation meant that any recovery operation would need to account for structural weakness at the breakpoint, and the possibility that attempting to lift the wreck could cause further fragmentation. With the wreck located and photographed, planning for the recovery operation intensified. Engineers at Global Marine Inc., a company specializing in deep-sea drilling that had been brought into the project under classified contract, began designing a ship capable of lifting the submarine from the ocean floor. The design they developed was unlike any vessel previously constructed. The ship would be 618 feet long with a beam of 115 feet, making it one of the largest ships in the world. At its center would be a massive opening, a moon pool measuring 199 feet by 74 feet, extending completely through the hull from the deck to the keel. Suspended within this opening would be a mechanical claw system designed to descend to the ocean floor, close around the submarine wreck, and lift it up through the moon pool into a concealed hold inside the ship. The claw mechanism would consist of massive steel beams, arranged in a pyramidal structure with hydraulically operated tines, designed to slide beneath the submarine hull and grip it securely. The entire mechanism would weigh more than 2,000 tons and would need to function reliably under extreme water pressure in near-freezing temperatures and complete darkness. The pipe string that would lower and raise the claw, a connected series of heavy-duty steel pipe sections, would need to be more than 16,000 feet long, strong enough to support the combined weight of the claw and the submarine, yet flexible enough to accommodate the movement of the ship on the ocean surface. Each section of pipe would be approximately 60 feet long and would weigh several tons. The ship would be equipped with a sophisticated dynamic positioning system, a computer-controlled thruster arrangement that could maintain the ship's position over a specific point on the ocean floor despite currents and wind, accurate to within a few feet. Construction would take place at the Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company Yard in Chester, Pennsylvania. The engineering challenges were compounded by the need for absolute secrecy. If the Soviet Union learned that the United States was attempting to recover K-129, Soviet naval forces could interfere with the operation, either by positioning ships nearby to observe or by deploying their own recovery assets. The CIA needed a cover story that would explain the presence of a massive ship conducting operations in the northern Pacific for an extended period without raising suspicion. The cover story that was developed centered on Howard Hughes, the reclusive billionaire industrialist. By 1970, Hughes had become one of the most famous and mysterious figures in America. He owned Hughes Tool Company, Hughes Aircraft, Trans World Airlines, and numerous other businesses. He lived in absolute seclusion, communicating with the outside world only through a small group of aides. He had not been photographed or interviewed in years. His eccentricity and reclusiveness made him a perfect candidate for the CIA's purposes because any unusual business venture associated with his name would be attributed to his known eccentricity rather than raising questions about intelligence operations. The CIA, working through intermediaries, approached Hughes Tool Company and negotiated an agreement under which the company would publicly announce a new commercial venture, deep-sea mining. Hughes would claim to be developing technology to extract manganese nodules, mineral deposits containing valuable metals, from the ocean floor. The ship being constructed would be described as a deep-sea mining vessel designed to test this new technology. The cover story was plausible because manganese nodules did exist on the Pacific seabed. Several companies had expressed interest in deep-sea mining as a future resource extraction method, and Hughes had sufficient wealth and reputation for ambitious technical projects that his involvement would not seem suspicious. Hughes Tool Company agreed to the arrangement. In return, the CIA would fund the entire operation, though the funding would be concealed through a complex series of financial transactions designed to make it appear that Hughes was investing his own money. The ship would be built by Global Marine and would be named Hughes Glomar Explorer. Hughes Tool would establish a subsidiary called Suma Corporation to manage the mining venture. Public announcements would reinforce the mining narrative. Hughes himself, by this time in severe mental decline and largely uninvolved in his business operations, was essentially a figurehead whose name and reputation provided cover while his aides managed the actual arrangement with the CIA. Construction of Hughes Glomar Explorer began in 1971. As construction proceeded, the CIA established an elaborate operational security apparatus to prevent information about the true purpose of the mission from leaking. Hundreds of workers were involved in building the ship, manufacturing the claw mechanism, and preparing support systems. Most believed they were working on a legitimate deep-sea mining project. Only a small number of senior engineers and managers knew the true purpose, and they were required to maintain absolute secrecy. During the same period, engineers were designing and constructing the capture vehicle, the giant claw that would grip the submarine. The device was built in segments at a facility operated by Lockheed Corporation under classified contract. The segments were then transported to a testing facility where they were assembled and tested under simulated deep-sea pressure conditions. The testing revealed numerous problems that required redesign and modification. Hydraulic systems failed under pressure. Structural components cracked. Control systems malfunctioned. Each failure necessitated additional engineering work and delayed the project. By 1973, Hughes Glomar Explorer was complete and undergoing sea trials. The ship was registered as a commercial vessel and was operated by a crew that included both civilian mariners employed by Global Marine and CIA personnel who posed as mining company employees. The crew members hired for their maritime skills were told they would be participating in the development of deep-sea mining technology. They were not informed about the ship's actual mission. In the summer of 1974, Hughes Glomar Explorer departed from Long Beach, California, accompanied by a barge carrying the capture vehicle. The barge, designated HMB-1, was a massive floating dry dock that concealed the claw mechanism from observation. The convoy proceeded northwest across the Pacific toward the target area where K-129 rested on the ocean floor. The operational plan called for the ship to arrive at the site, position itself precisely over the wreck using its dynamic positioning system, lower the capture vehicle on the pipe string to the ocean floor, maneuver the claw into position around the submarine, close the claw, and lift the submarine into the ship's internal hold. The entire process was estimated to require approximately 1 month of continuous operations. The convoy arrived at the target site in early July 1974. Positioning the ship over the exact coordinates of the wreck required several days of careful maneuvering. The system worked by using sonar to track transponders that had been placed on the ocean floor near the wreck during an earlier survey mission. By monitoring the ship's position relative to these transponders and adjusting the thrusters, the computer maintained the ship's position to within a tolerance of a few feet despite ocean currents and surface winds. Once positioned, the crew began the process of lowering the capture vehicle. The pipe string was assembled one section at a time, with each 60-foot section being lifted by cranes, connected to the previous section, and lowered through the moon pool. The process was slow and required absolute precision. Any misalignment in connecting the sections could cause structural failure when the full weight of the pipe string and capture vehicle was suspended at depth. It took approximately 1 week to lower the capture vehicle the full distance to the ocean floor. The claw was guided into position over the submarine wreck using sonar imaging and remotely operated cameras that provided real-time video feeds to operators inside the ship. The video quality was poor due to the extreme depth and darkness, but it was sufficient to maneuver the claw. On the evening of July the 4th, 1974, the capture vehicle reached the ocean floor and was positioned over the submarine wreck. Hydraulic systems began the process of extending the tines beneath the hull. This operation took several hours. The operators carefully maneuvered each tine to ensure it would grip the hull securely without causing the wreck to shift or fragment further. During the early morning hours of July the 4th, the tines were fully extended and hydraulic pressure was applied to close the claw. Operators reported that the hydraulic readings indicated the tines had successfully gripped the hull. The lift operation was authorized to begin. Lifting the submarine required reversing the lowering process. Each section of pipe was slowly raised, then disconnected and removed as the next section emerged from the moon pool. The process was agonizingly slow. The combined weight of the capture vehicle and the submarine, estimated at more than 4,000 tons, placed enormous stress on every component of the pipe string. Engineers had calculated safety margins, but the reality of lifting such weight from such depth meant operating at the absolute limits of the material's structural capacity. The lift proceeded continuously for approximately 1 week. As the pipe string was raised, operators monitored tension readings, hydraulic pressures, and video feeds from cameras on the capture vehicle. Then, approximately 1 week into the lift operation and roughly 8,000 feet below the surface, halfway through the recovery, operators in the ship's control room observed a sudden change in tension readings. Video feeds showed debris falling past the cameras. Hydraulic pressure indicators fluctuated erratically. The lift operation was immediately halted while engineers assessed what had happened. Analysis of the data indicated that a structural failure had occurred. Part of the submarine wreck had broken away from the section held by the claw and had fallen back to the ocean floor. The remaining section was still gripped by the capture vehicle, but a significant portion of the wreck had been lost. The decision was made to continue raising what remained. Over the following days, the capture vehicle and its partial load were brought up through the remaining distance. In mid-August 1974, the capture vehicle emerged into the moon pool with approximately one-third of K-129's hull still gripped in its tines. Once the wreck section was secured inside the ship's internal hold and the moon pool doors were closed to conceal the operation from any overhead observation, crew members began the process of pumping out the seawater and examining what had been recovered. The section that had been brought to the surface was the forward portion of the submarine, including parts of the bow, the forward crew compartments, and one of the torpedo tubes. The aft section, containing the missile compartment and the nuclear missiles themselves, had been the portion that broke away during the lift. The examination of the recovered section was conducted by CIA technical specialists who had been aboard the ship posing as mining engineers. They documented everything: the construction of the hull, the equipment in the crew spaces, the materials used in various components. What had been recovered included acoustic tiles from the hull that revealed Soviet noise-dampening technology, torpedo tube construction details, some navigation equipment, documents about patrol procedures, and personal effects. Inside the flooded compartments, they found the remains of 6 Soviet sailors who had gone down with the submarine. The bodies were in varying states of preservation due to the cold temperature and high pressure at depth. What had not been recovered, and had been the primary intelligence targets, were the nuclear missiles with their warheads, the cryptographic machines and code books, the missile guidance systems, the communications equipment room, and most of the crew remains. The intelligence value of what was recovered was significant in terms of understanding Soviet submarine construction techniques and some operational procedures, but it fell far short of the comprehensive intelligence windfall the operation had been designed to achieve. One of the more unusual aspects of the mission's aftermath was the decision regarding the 6 bodies recovered from the wreck. CIA leadership determined that these sailors should be treated with respect and given a proper burial. In early September 1974, in a ceremony that was filmed for classified documentation, the bodies were wrapped in Soviet flags and buried at sea with full military honors. A naval chaplain read a service. The burial location was recorded in classified documents in case future diplomatic circumstances might make it appropriate to inform Soviet authorities. The film of the burial would remain classified for more than 3 decades. The ceremony itself represented an acknowledgement, never publicly stated at the time, that these Soviet sailors had died in service to their country and deserved respect even though they had been adversaries. With the mission complete, Hughes' Glomar explorer returned to Long Beach in late August 1974. The ship's arrival was reported in maritime industry publications as the return of Howard Hughes's deep-sea mining vessel from its initial test voyage. Press releases issued by Summa Corporation claimed that the test had been successful and that Hughes intended to continue developing the technology. No mention was made of any submarine recovery operation. The CIA's intention was to return to the site and attempt to recover the remaining section of K-129 that had broken away and fallen back to the ocean floor. However, events would make this impossible. In the summer of 1974, while Hughes' Glomar Explorer was conducting its recovery operation, a break-in occurred at the Summa Corporation offices in Los Angeles. The burglary appeared to be an ordinary crime. The offices of several companies in the building were entered, and various items were stolen. However, among the materials taken from the Summa offices were documents related to the Hughes Glomar Explorer project. The burglars were never definitively identified, and it remains unclear whether they understood the significance of what they had stolen, or whether the documents were simply among random materials taken during the break-in. Some of the stolen documents eventually made their way to individuals who recognized that they were reading about something far more significant than deep-sea mining. By early 1975, information about the submarine recovery operation had begun to circulate among journalists. In February 1975, investigative journalists, including Jack Anderson and Seymour Hersh, began reporting on elements of a CIA operation involving Howard Hughes and a sunken submarine. The CIA moved quickly to contain the disclosure. Agency officials contacted major publications and requested that they not publish additional details about the operation. The request was made on national security grounds, with CIA representatives arguing that publishing information about the recovery operation could damage U.S. intelligence capabilities and could provoke a confrontation with the Soviet Union. Most major newspapers agreed to withhold the story, at least temporarily. However, by March 1975, enough information had leaked that the story could no longer be contained. On March 18, 1975, the New York Times published an article revealing that the CIA had conducted a covert operation to raise a Soviet submarine from the Pacific Ocean floor, and that Howard Hughes's mining venture had been a cover story. The disclosure created a complicated situation. The Soviet Union issued formal protests, claiming that the operation had violated international law and had constituted theft of Soviet property. The legal status of the operation existed in a gray area of international maritime law. The 1958 Geneva Convention on the High Seas recognized salvage rights for vessels in international waters, but the convention had been drafted with civilian shipping in mind, not military vessels carrying nuclear weapons. Soviet officials argued that military vessels retained sovereign immunity regardless of location, and that attempting to salvage one constituted theft. American legal scholars countered that abandoned property in international waters could be claimed under salvage law. The question had no clear precedent, and neither government pursued formal legal action. The ambiguity served both sides. The United States could claim legal justification for the recovery attempt, while the Soviet Union could protest the violation without admitting the extent of their own inability to locate and recover their submarine. The United States government initially declined to comment, neither confirming nor denying that any such operation had occurred. This non-response became the origin of what would later be called the Glomar response, an official statement that an agency can neither confirm nor deny the existence of requested information, named after the Hughes Glomar explorer. The Soviet government's public protests were accompanied by internal debates about how to respond. Acknowledging that the CIA had located and partially recovered K-129 would require admitting that the Soviet Navy had been unable to find its own submarine and had been unaware that the Americans had conducted a recovery operation. This would represent a significant intelligence and military failure. Soviet media coverage was limited, and families of K-129's crew were not informed about the American operation. Within the CIA and among intelligence analysts, there was significant debate about whether the operation had been worth the enormous cost. The total expenditure for Project AZORIAN was eventually estimated at approximately $800 million in 1974 dollars, equivalent to roughly $5 billion in current value. Some analysts argued that even the partial recovery had provided valuable intelligence about Soviet submarine construction and operations. Others contended that the intelligence gained did not justify the cost, especially since the most valuable components had not been recovered. There was also debate about whether a second recovery mission should be attempted. The aft section of K-129, containing the missile compartment and the nuclear warheads, remained on the ocean floor where it had fallen during the structural failure. In principle, Hughes' Glomar Explorer could return to the site and attempt another lift. However, with the operation now publicly disclosed, such a mission would be impossible to conceal. Soviet naval forces would certainly observe and likely interfere with any American ship operating in the area. The decision was made to abandon plans for a second recovery mission. Hughes' Glomar Explorer was eventually sold and converted for use in actual deep-sea drilling operations. The ship operated in this capacity for decades, drilling for oil in various locations around the world until it was finally retired and sold in 2015. For the families of K-129's crew, the story was one of enduring mystery and eventual revelation. When the submarine had been declared lost in 1968, the families had been told only that the vessel and all hands had been lost at sea. The Soviet government provided no details about where the submarine had sunk or what had caused the loss. Memorial services were held, and the crew members were honored as heroes of the Soviet Union, but their families received no information about the circumstances of their deaths. When the New York Times revealed Project AZORIAN in 1975, Soviet authorities faced their dilemma about acknowledgement. The decision was made to suppress the story within the Soviet Union. Soviet media did not report on the revelations, and families of K-129's crew were not informed. It was not until decades later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, that information about Project AZORIAN became more widely known in Russia. In the 1990s, Russian naval historians began publishing accounts of K-129's loss and the American recovery operation. Families of crew members learned for the first time that their relative's submarine had been found by the Americans and that some remains had been recovered. In 2007, the CIA took the unusual step of releasing to Russian officials the classified film of the burial ceremony that had been conducted in 1974. The film was presented to Russian naval authorities and subsequently shown to some of the families. For relatives of the 6 sailors whose bodies had been recovered, the film provided a form of closure that they had never expected to receive nearly 40 years after the loss. Among those who viewed the film was the widow of one of the 6 recovered sailors. In interviews conducted by Russian journalists in 2008, she described the complicated emotions of watching American sailors lower her husband's flag-draped body into the Pacific. She expressed gratitude that he had been honored, but also anger that she had not been informed for more than 30 years, robbing her of the closure the burial might have provided when her grief was fresh. Her children, who had been young when their father died, saw the film as evidence of respect between adversaries, but it could not replace the decades they had spent without knowing his fate. Some family members expressed gratitude that their relatives had been treated with respect and given a proper burial. Others questioned why the Americans had not informed Soviet authorities at the time, which might have allowed the bodies to be returned to their families. The emotions were complicated, grief mixed with appreciation, anger at decades of official silence, mixed with relief at finally knowing something of what had happened. The causes of K-129's sinking have never been definitively determined. The Soviet Navy conducted its own investigation in 1968, but was hampered by its inability to locate the wreck. Theories have ranged from catastrophic battery explosion to accidental collision with an American submarine to failure of the ballast systems that caused the submarine to exceed its maximum safe depth and implode. One persistent theory suggested that K-129 had collided with USS Swordfish, an American attack submarine operating in the area, but this was later debunked by examination of Swordfish and analysis of the wreck. The CIA's examination of the recovered section did not produce a clear answer, though analysts concluded that the most likely cause was either a battery explosion or a ballast system failure. The technical achievements of Project AZORIAN were, by any measure, extraordinary. The operation required developing new technologies for deep-sea lifting, building one of the largest and most sophisticated ships of its kind ever constructed, maintaining a cover story that deceived Soviet intelligence for years, and executing a recovery operation at depths that pushed the limits of existing engineering capabilities. The fact that the operation succeeded in recovering even a portion of the submarine was, in the assessment of many engineers involved, remarkable given the unprecedented challenges, but the strategic value remained debated. The compromise of the operation's secrecy within months of its completion meant that no follow-up mission could be attempted, leaving the most valuable intelligence targets on the ocean floor. The legacy of Project AZORIAN within the intelligence community is one of both achievement and caution. It demonstrated that the CIA could undertake and execute extraordinarily complex technical operations requiring innovation, secrecy, and coordination among multiple agencies and contractors. It also illustrated the limitations of even the most sophisticated covert operations when faced with the challenges of maintaining secrecy over extended periods, the unpredictability of structural failures despite meticulous engineering, and the reality that ambitious operations do not always achieve their full objectives regardless of the resources committed. The human dimensions of the story extend in multiple directions. The 98 crew members of K-129 died in the service of their country, likely in an instant when the submarine's hull catastrophically failed at depth. Their families mourned them, without knowing where or how they had died. 6 of those crew members were brought to the surface decades later by the intelligence service of their country's adversary and were given a military burial by people who had been their enemies. 92 sailors remain with their submarine on the Pacific floor. The wreck of K-129 remains on the Pacific Ocean floor at a depth of approximately 16,500 feet, roughly 1,560 nautical miles northwest of Hawaii. The aft section that broke away during the CIA's lift operation in 1974 rests on the seabed, along with the forward section that was not recovered. In the decades since Project AZORIAN, the wreck site has been visited several times by deep-sea research vessels. Russian naval authorities conducted their own examination of the site in the 1990s, documenting what remained and confirming that the aft section of the submarine, including the missile compartment, remains largely intact. The location where the 6 sailors were buried at sea has been recorded in classified documents but has never been publicly disclosed. The burial location remains known only to a small number of American and Russian officials. Project AZORIAN was officially declassified by the CIA in 2010, 36 years after the recovery operation and 35 years after the operation's existence was revealed by the press. The declassification included the release of hundreds of pages of documents, technical drawings, photographs, and the film of the burial ceremony. The release of these materials allowed historians to reconstruct the operation in detail and to understand both its technical achievements and its limitations. What remains most striking about the story is not the technical achievement or the intelligence gained or the cost of the operation, but rather the intersection of grand geopolitical competition with individual human lives. Soviet sailors died serving their country. American engineers spent years building a ship to retrieve their remains and their submarine. CIA officers planned an operation that succeeded partially and failed partially. Families mourned for decades without knowing what had happened, and at the end of it all, most of what the operation had been designed to recover remained on the ocean floor where it still rests today. The question of whether Project AZORIAN was worth its cost has no simple answer, because the question itself requires choosing what to measure and what to value. If measured purely by intelligence gained versus resources expended, the operation's return was modest. If measured by technical achievement and proof of capability, the operation was extraordinary. If measured by human cost and impact on families, the operation created both harm and, eventually, a form of closure. John Parangoski was 47 years old when Project AZORIAN began in 1968. He was 53 when the operation was publicly disclosed in 1975, ending any possibility of attempting a second recovery mission. He continued working on classified programs for the CIA for another decade before retiring. In interviews he gave in his later years, after the operation had been declassified and he was permitted to discuss it, he reflected that Azorian had been both his greatest professional achievement and a source of enduring frustration. Achievement in proving that such a recovery was technically feasible, frustration in knowing that so much of the submarine had been lost during the lift, and that the full intelligence value of the operation had never been realized. David Sharp, one of the senior engineers who had worked on designing the capture vehicle and who later wrote the most comprehensive account of the project based on declassified documents, described the structural failure that caused part of the wreck to break away as the operation's defining moment. Everything had functioned as designed up until that point. The ship's positioning had been precise, the pipe string had performed flawlessly, the capture vehicle had gripped the wreck successfully, but the stresses involved in lifting more than 4,000 tons of corroded metal from extreme depth had exceeded what the submarine's deteriorated structure could withstand. When the hull section fractured, there had been nothing the operators could do except continue raising what remained. The story of the Hughes Glomar explorer and the CIA's attempt to steal a Soviet submarine from the bottom of the Pacific Ocean is ultimately a story about the gap between ambition and outcome, between what seems possible with unlimited resources and what actually proves achievable when confronted with the physical reality of raising thousands of tons of corroded metal from 3 miles beneath the ocean surface. It is a story about Cold War competition that drove both superpowers to attempt operations that seemed impossible. It is a story about 98 Soviet sailors who died when their submarine sank, and whose remains became the object of a recovery operation they could never have imagined. It is a story about secrecy carefully maintained for years and then compromised by events that had nothing to do with intelligence work. And it is a story that raises questions about what intelligence operations achieve, what they cost, and what they mean for the people whose lives they touch. The engineers who spend years building ships for secret missions, the sailors who die in service to their countries, the families who mourn without knowing the full story for decades, and the intelligence officers who plan operations that succeed brilliantly in some ways and fail unexpectedly in others, leaving them to measure achievement against limitation and to wonder whether the extraordinary effort was justified by the incomplete result.